It was a cold, silent night when everything began. The clock on the wall showed 2:47 a.m., its ticking the only sound in the room. The apartment was dark, except for the faint glow from a phone screen lighting up a face buried in bed. The television had been off for hours, the lights too, and even the city outside had grown unusually quiet. The world seemed to be holding its breath. In that moment of stillness, a sudden knock echoed through the apartment. Just one. Firm. Clear. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but not soft enough to ignore. At first, the mind questioned whether it had imagined the sound, perhaps a noise from the pipes or a dream leaking into the waking world. But curiosity stirred, pulling attention away from the screen. One earbud was removed, and the silence of the room grew heavier. Everything stood still. Then came the second knock. Not at the front door, but from the back. 3 slow, steady knocks that seemed to press against the spine like ice. That door led to a narrow alley that rarely saw anyone pass through, even in daylight. Delivery men never used it, and neighbors never knocked from there. It was a forgotten entrance, rarely opened, barely acknowledged. The hallway leading to it was dimly lit, and the glass window in the door was frosted, making it impossible to see who or what stood on the other side. Heartbeats quickened, but the steps toward the kitchen were slow, cautious. Every creak in the floor felt like a scream. The figure appeared then, just a shadow at first. Tall, still, almost like part of the wall, but it was there, unmistakably, human in shape, standing completely still behind the frosted glass. No sound came from it, no voice, no motion, just presence. A breath was taken, shaky and uncertain. A quiet question left the lips. "Who's there?" But no reply came. The silence deepened, like a weight pressing down on the chest. With each passing second, the sense of being watched grew stronger, heavier. The shadow didn't move, didn't flinch. It just waited, as if it had all the time in the world. There was something deeply wrong about the way it stood, too patient, too calm, like it wasn't just a stranger at a door, but something else. Something that didn't belong. The figure then shifted, not away, not toward the door, but upward. It climbed, not like a person would using limbs and effort, but with a fluid, unnatural grace that defied reason. Eyes followed it up the glass, heart pounding louder than ever. Above the door was a small window near the ceiling, and then, from up there, came a new sound. Soft, cold, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Whatever had been knocking was no longer at the door. It was now above, watching from the darkness above. The apartment was no longer a safe space. It had become something else entirely, a place where something unknown had arrived in the dead of night. The figure behind the frosted glass had vanished from view, but its presence still lingered like a cold breath on the back of the neck. The kitchen, once familiar and warm, had turned into a stage for something unnatural. The air felt thicker, heavier, almost as if the very walls were holding their breath. Silence returned, but it was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that screamed. Fingers trembled as they reached for the phone, the soft glow of the screen barely enough to push back the darkness. A quiet but urgent call was made to the police, words whispered with shaky breath, explaining that someone, or something, was at the back door. The voice on the other end remained calm, professional, offering instructions to lock all doors and remain in a safe room until help arrived. But safety felt like a lie now, something that once existed, but had since slipped. Out through the cracks in the window, every step backward from the kitchen felt like a retreat from sanity. A knife was taken from the counter, an instinct, not a plan. Feet moved silently, guided more by fear than thought. Then came the sound again, movement. But this time, it wasn't near the door. It was above. Something creaked softly overhead, and eyes were drawn to the small window near the ceiling. There was no clear view, just shadows and moonlight. But something shifted there. The soft tap returned, faint but clear. Tap, tap, tap. Something had climbed up the wall and was now perched above, as if studying the inside from a higher vantage point. The thought of it being on the roof or hanging from the side of the building turned the stomach. The idea of something that could move that way, without sound, without effort, tore apart the logic of normal life. Steps turned into a quiet run, and the bathroom door was shut and locked with a soft click. The bathroom was small, windowless, and suddenly felt like a sanctuary. Knees pulled close to the chest, back pressed against the cold tiles. Breathing slowed only because it had to. The phone screen, glowing softly in the dark, became the only source of comfort. Time passed in uneven chunks, minutes that felt like hours. Then, without warning, every light went out. The phone's battery still held on, but the apartment was now completely dark. And then, the sound of footsteps returned. Slow, deliberate, heavy, they echoed faintly through the hallway, growing closer with each passing second. There had been no sound of the door opening, no broken glass, no forced entry. But something was inside. It moved like it knew the space, like it had been there before. The footsteps stopped just outside the bathroom door. The wood seemed thinner now, the lock weaker. A sound followed, barely audible but unmistakable. Breathing, deep and slow, right against the door. Whatever had come in hadn't come to talk. It had come to listen, and it was already too close. The tension in the bathroom was unbearable, thick and heavy like the air before a storm. The sound of breathing outside the door was steady, deliberate. It wasn't the kind of breathing that came from someone trying to hide. No, this was too controlled, almost as if it were savoring the moment. The noise filled the small room, making the walls feel like they were closing in. Every breath was a reminder that whatever stood outside the door wasn't human. It couldn't be. But the rational part of the mind struggled to reject what was happening. How could this be real? How could something so unnatural be happening right here, right now? The only answer came in the form of a steady rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. A slow and calculated knock at the door, each tap sinking deeper into the chest, each second stretching longer than the last. The phone was still clutched tightly in hand, the screen glowing faintly in the darkness, offering a small sense of connection to the outside world. The police were coming, the operator had said, but the minutes felt like hours. The words of reassurance from the officer seemed distant, muffled by the sound of the breath outside. There had been no sign of struggle, no forced entry. The back door had been locked, no windows had been broken. And yet, something, was inside the apartment, standing at the bathroom door, breathing, waiting. The door trembled slightly as though it was being tested, the lock being prodded, but it held firm. Every inch of the bathroom felt like it was being suffocated by the weight of the unknown. Time stretched. Seconds felt like days. Then, a shift in the air. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed down the hallway. They weren't the frantic, panicked steps of someone desperate to escape. These were calm, calculated, as if the creature outside knew exactly where it was going. And it wasn't going anywhere. It was coming closer. Every movement, every sound, heightened the fear. But something deeper than that began to crawl into the mind, the realization that it wasn't just a threat from the outside. No, it had come inside. It was already in the room, circling, waiting, maybe even watching. The breathing outside the door stopped. For a moment, everything was still, so still that it felt unnatural. Then a voice whispered from the other side, soft, almost too quiet to hear. "Let me in." The words didn't carry the desperation of someone in need. There was no panic in the tone. It was casual, familiar even, too familiar. The voice sounded almost like the person inside the room had spoken it themselves. But that couldn't be right. The voice on the other side of the door was wrong. It couldn't be theirs. A new sound broke the stillness, a deep, creaking noise. It came from above, not just the door, but from above, from the ceiling. The floorboards groaned as something moved, something heavy, something wrong. Panic shot through every fiber of the body. The door felt even thinner now, weaker, as if the very air inside was pressing against it, urging it to break open. And then, without warning, the footsteps began again. But this time, they weren't coming from outside the door. They were coming from somewhere inside the apartment, creeping closer, slower, like it was making sure nothing would stop it. It wasn't just standing at the door anymore. The thing was circling, waiting for the right moment. It was only a matter of time before the door would open. And when it did, it was unclear who or what would walk through it. The silence that followed felt even worse than the noise. Each second felt like an eternity, stretching endlessly, heavier with every passing breath. The footsteps had stopped. The eerie breathing was gone. Yet, there was no relief. The air felt too thick, as if it were alive, pressing against the chest, making it harder to breathe. The bathroom, once a place of comfort, now felt like a tomb, suffocating and cold. The only sound in the room was the frantic pounding of the heart, a constant reminder that something, someone, was out there, moving closer, getting closer. Then came the whisper again. It was faint, barely audible over the noise of the heart, thumping in the chest, but it was unmistakable. "Let me in." The voice was different now. It was no longer calm, no longer casual. It was filled with urgency, a twisted kind of desperation that chilled the bones. The words felt wrong, like they weren't meant for the moment, like they were something more sinister than just a plea. The voice, so familiar, sounded almost like the very own whisper of a mind fighting its own descent into madness. Shivers ran down the spine as every instinct screamed to run, to escape, but the bathroom had no exit. There were no windows, no back door. Just the single door, the one that was now trembling as if something outside was testing it, testing the lock, pushing it with unnatural strength. The door creaked under the pressure, and every sound felt amplified in the dead quiet of the apartment. The walls seemed to close in. The floor beneath the feet felt as if it was shifting. The air felt colder now, biting at the skin, bringing a chill that seeped deep into the bones. The faint sound of claws, no, fingers, scratching lightly at the door echoed through the room. The walls, the door, the air, everything seemed to bend under the weight of whatever was just outside. The sound, at first subtle, grew louder, each scrape like nails on a chalkboard, sharp and grating. The hairs on the back of the neck stood on end as the scratching began to change, shifting from a soft sound to a rhythmic tapping, slow and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere closer. It was coming from the ceiling. The floorboards beneath the feet groaned, the unmistakable sound of something moving, something that had no business being there. Then the lights flickered. A weak pulse of light, struggling against the overwhelming darkness, and then, click, the apartment went dark again. The faint glow of the phone was the only thing left, casting long, shaky shadows across the room. But the shadows, they weren't quite right. They moved in ways they shouldn't have. They twisted. They reached out from the corners of the room like fingers stretching from the darkness itself. The fear that had been building now had form, had shape. The dark, the void, was alive, reaching, crawling closer with every breath. Then, without warning, the sound of something falling broke the stillness. A crash, loud and violent. The phone slipped from the grasp and clattered to the floor. But the sound wasn't just from the phone. It came from somewhere else, somewhere deeper in the apartment. It was the sound of something being thrown. Furniture, glass, a body? The mind couldn't comprehend. The only thing that made sense was the door. The bathroom door. It wasn't safe here. It never was. The door rattled again, and this time, it wasn't the soft test of a push. The door was being pounded. The thing outside was no longer waiting. It was trying to get in, trying to break through. The lock strained under the force, and in that moment, every inch of reality cracked. There was no escape. Only the door. Only the pounding. And what was on the other side? The pounding on the bathroom door grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was on the other side was no longer content with the quiet waiting game. The wood of the door shook under the force, splintering in small places, and the air became thick, with the scent of something sour, something almost metallic, filling the room. The sound of the door rattling violently echoed in the small space, mixing with the frantic heartbeat that pounded in the chest. Each thud, each crash against the door seemed to bend time itself, stretching the moments into an agonizing eternity. The lock groaned as it was pushed beyond its limit, and the door buckled again, creaking as though it might give way any second. The small room, once a place of refuge, now felt like a coffin, closing in with each second. Desperation began to set in as the thought of escape became nothing more than a cruel joke. There was no way out. Not through the door, not through the walls. Only one door, one single point of entry. And whatever stood outside was making sure that door would be gone soon enough. The phone on the floor remained silent, its weak glow no longer offering any sense of comfort. The call to the police had been cut off long ago, no one answering on the other side. The shadows in the room twisted and shifted, warping in unnatural ways, as if something was crawling just out of sight, moving with a slithering grace. The feeling of being trapped was suffocating. The air felt like it was closing in, thick with fear, and it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It wasn't just the pounding at the door anymore. Something else was happening. The sounds of movement above the apartment, the scraping, the tapping, had stopped. But now there were whispers. Soft, faint murmurs, like voices that didn't belong in the space, leaking through the walls. They weren't coming from outside the door. They were coming from inside. It felt as though the very walls of the apartment were alive, whispering, secrets and threats in a language that couldn't be understood, but could be felt. The skin crawled with the sensation of eyes watching from every corner. Every movement felt watched, every breath measured. The door gave way with a loud, terrifying crack. The lock snapped, splintering under the weight of whatever force had been, pushing against it. The door swung open violently, crashing against the wall with a sickening thud. And there, in the doorway, stood nothing. No figure. No face. No shadow. Just the deep, suffocating darkness that seemed to spill from the open door, swirling into the room like smoke, filling the air with a coldness that bit into the bones. The whispering intensified, becoming clearer, sharper. It wasn't a voice anymore. It was a presence, an overwhelming sensation of being surrounded, of being within something that shouldn't exist. The darkness didn't move like shadows should. It moved with purpose, curling, pressing in closer. No longer could the mind deny what was happening. Something other was in the room, something that didn't belong in this world. The phone's weak light flickered one last time before dying completely, leaving the room in total blackness. Then, the whispers stopped. The air became still, impossibly still, as though the world had stopped moving entirely. But the feeling of something just there remained. The cold breath against the skin, the feeling of something circling. It was close. Too close. But still, the eyes could see nothing. No figure, no shape. Just the crushing weight of the darkness. And then, A voice, clear and chilling, whispered directly into the ear. "You're not alone." The darkness seemed to close in tighter, suffocating everything in its path. A cold gust of air swept through the bathroom, its touch like ice against the skin, making every hair stand on end. For a moment, everything was silent. The whispers had stopped, the door had opened, and yet nothing had entered. The overwhelming sense of being watched grew heavier. It was as though the very walls of the apartment had come alive, stretching and pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. Time itself had slowed, and the mind struggled to grasp reality, caught between the logic of the human world and the terrifying unknown that surrounded. There was no figure in the doorway, no solid shape to face. Yet, the sensation of something there, of a presence just beyond the edge of perception, remained. Every breath felt like it echoed through the room, too loud, too sharp, and yet there was no escape from the weight of the stillness. The very air felt different now, thick with something unexplainable, something wrong. The shadows no longer clung to the corners of the room. They moved, slowly, deliberately, like fingers stretching from the edges of the world, reaching to wrap around everything, to pull it closer into the void. Each movement in the room felt unnatural, too deliberate. The walls creaked as if bending under the weight of something unseen. The faintest sound, barely a whisper, but more felt than heard, slid through the room. "It's not over." The voice was different this time, clearer, almost familiar, but wrong. The words felt like they were spoken from within the room itself, as though the apartment had become the voice. Then came a sudden sound, sharp and jarring, like something snapping. The phone on the floor had cracked open, its screen shattered, as though it had been crushed under the weight of the unseen force. The light had gone out, but the feeling of something moving, watching, never stopped. With a slow, deliberate crawl, something began to emerge from the darkness. It wasn't a figure, not a shape or a silhouette, but a movement within the shadows themselves. The darkness seemed to shift, folding in on itself, swirling like smoke. It moved with a purpose, flowing through the room like water, yet it had the weight of something solid, something with intent. The air felt colder still as it spread, reaching for every corner, every surface, until the apartment was engulfed in it. The suffocating, heavy presence in the room pressed in, making it impossible to think clearly. The sense of something moving in and out of the shadows grew stronger. It wasn't a thing, not like a person or an animal, but something more ancient, more primal. The feeling of its touch came first as a chill, cold and sharp, biting into the skin. Then, it was the weight of its gaze. The sensation that whatever was inside the room was watching every movement, hearing every breath, and waiting. Waiting for something. The floor beneath the feet shifted, and the walls trembled again. The world seemed to warp, bending under the presence in the room. The door had fully opened, but there was no figure, no shape to look at, no body to see. Only the darkness closing in tighter, suffocating everything in its path. The feeling that something was moving, slithering, crawling, became undeniable. It wasn't the air anymore. It wasn't just the dark. The room was alive, twisting with a force that shouldn't exist in the natural world. The coldness seeped deeper, and the oppressive weight of the room began to crush, making every breath a battle. The final whisper echoed through the space, not from outside, but from within. "This is just the beginning." The room felt like it was collapsing, the walls closing in with a suffocating force. The darkness wasn't just something that filled the space. It had become alive, a tangible, consuming presence that twisted and churned. Every inch of the apartment seemed to be swallowed by it, and with each passing second, the feeling of being utterly trapped intensified. The coldness in the air turned from uncomfortable to unbearable, pressing against the skin, as if the very temperature of the room was a living thing, intent on crushing any sense of warmth or safety. There was no escaping it, no place to run. Every corner of the room seemed to pulse with malevolent intent, and the very air felt thick with something that didn't belong. The whispers, once soft and distant, now filled the room in a low, constant murmur. It wasn't clear what was being said. Words became unimportant, replaced by a sensation of crawling dread that wrapped around the mind. The mind could no longer fight the growing sense of wrongness, the overwhelming certainty that something was lurking in the shadows, something ancient, something powerful. The room wasn't just dark anymore. The darkness seemed to move, sliding across the floor like a living shadow, creeping into every crevice, spilling into the walls, folding over the furniture, twisting around the legs of the chair. The air felt alive, as if the room itself had become sentient, aware, and watching. The sensation of eyes, hundreds of eyes, staring from every corner of the room grew stronger, piercing through the soul with an intensity that made the breath catch in the throat. No longer was there a door to be worried about. No longer was there a lock to protect the fragile boundary between safety and horror. The room had become the cage. Every surface was tainted with a malignant energy, a deep, overwhelming force that clung to the skin, to the thoughts, to the heart. The very floor beneath the feet began to buckle, as if the structure of the apartment itself was breaking apart. The light, what little remained, flickered one last time, casting sharp, jagged shadows that seemed to come alive, stretching and twisting in impossible shapes. The whispering grew louder, swirling around, filling the room with an unbearable pressure. The voice was no longer distant or strange. It was familiar now, a voice that should have been comforting, but now sounded hollow, like a mockery of something loved. It repeated a single phrase over and over, growing louder with each echo. "You cannot hide." The realization struck like a blow to the chest. The room was no longer the source of fear. The thing, the force that had once been a whisper, a shadow, had become the room itself, had become the entire space. The apartment had become the nightmare. And then everything stopped. The air went still. The darkness froze, unmoving, like a suffocating hand pressing against the lungs. For a moment, there was only silence, an empty, oppressive silence that filled the room with a sense of finality. The shadows no longer crept along the floor. The whispers no longer echoed. But then, out of the stillness, came the sound of the door creaking. The door, once broken and open, slowly began to close by itself. Not from the force of a wind or any external cause. It closed as if it had a will, as if the room itself was pushing it shut. The final sound that rang out was the snap of the lock falling back into place. And with that, the room went dark. Completely dark. The nightmare had claimed its hold, and the mind, overwhelmed, knew with cold certainty there was no escape.